Okay, so I'm Sarah Restad, and I did my project about Alzheimer's disease and if a geographical factor would have any effect on which area would have the most cases of Alzheimer's. So first what I did was I obtained statistics of how many Alzheimer's patients died in each state, because I couldn't really obtain statistics about how many Alzheimer's patients were in each state because there's a diagnosing issue and a lack of reporting issue, but they were pretty clear about who had died. So after I did that, I normalized it for the population because that's helpful, because if you're just like California has X number and Wyoming has this, you can be like California has more, but that might not be the case. And then after that, I normalized it for the elderly population, which basically means I took into account what percent of the population was elderly, so it wasn't a big skew that they had more elderly people and hence more cases of death. So my original hypothesis about what would affect the spread of the data was I thought that it would likely have an effect because of population, but that, after I looked into it, had really very little effect. So after I found my results, I was kind of just determined to find anything that I could to find a factor that affected certain states and why they would turn out this way, because all of my data showed that the highest percent of Alzheimer's related deaths are in the West. Basically the darkest is from North Dakota and South Dakota west, but there are some states in here that have very low cases of Alzheimer's. So I was able to find three factors that explain the distribution somewhat. I could not find one factor that had a perfect correlation, but the first one I found was cancer prevalence. And though you can't really see, you can see that a lot of the West is pretty light. There's not a lot of cases of cancer. Well, there's not, compared to the rest of the US, there's not. But if you look at the East Coast, it does mirror my data to a certain extent, where the New York, which had the least amount of Alzheimer's, has one of the highest amounts of cancer. And it's it's a negative correlation between those two factors. And then I looked into the distribution of smoking, which also had a somewhat negative correlation with my data, because that's kind of the one that I looked at the Midwest for, because a lot of the Midwest was somewhere in the middle, but they have a pretty high incidence of smoking. And then the West has a lower incidence of smoking. And so my hypothesis about why both of those had a negative correlation was because those things tend to kill people before Alzheimer's would. Smoking has a slew of health risks, and then cancer obviously is fairly fatal in most cases. And then the one I found most interesting was when I looked into the population of World War II veterans across the United States, and I found almost a perfect correlation between what I got in the West, where Wyoming was lighter and Wyoming had fewer World War II veterans, Nevada had fewer World War II veterans, as compared to California and Arizona. And what I found out about that I thought was really interesting is a lot of times if people have PTSD, they're at about a 50% more likelihood of developing Alzheimer's, just because it affects the hippocampus in the brain, which is the main source of retaining memories.